You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 263 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm going to be talking nuclear weapons and the potential of the Trump administration to get us into a new arms race with Russia. In some ways, I think this is going to be kind of an extension of the last episode of the show where I focused on the Trump administration's threat to withdraw from the INF Treaty. And so I got some analysis of that on today's show, and talking about some updates and stuff going on in the Trump administration that's happened since. So, it may be worth it to check out that episode if you have the time, before you listen to this one. But, I should explain enough and it should have made sense without repeating myself too much here on today's show. So hope you all like it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. And the best place to find my work is, of course, the Libertarian Institute. There I also have my daily news roundup, which, it's almost the show notes page for the shows, except a little bit more since there's some articles I linked to in there about stuff that isn't just foreign policy. Mostly, I think I try to focus on executive branch and just government abuses of power in general and police abuse and important developments going on in other countries unrelated to their foreign policy. And then, of course, the show is also featured there on the homepage, as, of course, it could be found all at libertarianinstitute.org. So I'll start off with this article published by Cato, Dan Glaser, and Eric Gomez. It's not very long. I'm going to link to it in the show notes page, so it's worth reading on your own, but just to lay it out a little bit here. Glaser and Gomez explained the situation that the INF Treaty has been important to arms control for the United States, and that, it's likely that these Russian missiles that the U.S. is complaining about probably are in violation of the INF Treaty, and it's also possible that the United States drones, some of our like Reaper and Predator armed drones could be violations of this treaty, as well as our Patriot missile systems, which also play, an important role here that I'll talk about in a minute, are violations of the INF Treaty. To explain the Patriot missile situation just quickly, you really have to go back to the Bush administration, when then administration official John Bolton, who is of course now the national security advisor to Donald Trump, was a key member of the push to get Bush to withdraw from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And this treaty prevented either the United States from Russia from developing missile defense systems. And the reason for this is that it would prevent one side from gaining first strike capability. And so the U.S. withdrew from that and made these anti-ballistic missiles. They have the THAAD missile systems and then the Patriot missiles. If you look at, the cost of these systems, it has been huge. And I don't think, at least from my take on it and all the evidence that I've read, that these systems work particularly well. I don't feel safe that one of the THAAD missile systems is out there to, supposedly shoot down all the nukes coming at the United States of America. And of course now we have the announcement from Russia where they developed some long-range cruise missile systems that are actually able to pretty much bypass the American missile defense systems. And so I'm guessing from a much cheaper price tag, because the American anti-missile systems are extremely expensive. And while we do sell some of them to foreign countries, it really only profits the weapons makers and doesn't repay the American people for all the money they sunk into these very ineffective systems. So getting back to the article, Glaser and Gomez then kind of point out that there's room for negotiation here, and that, that's the right way to go on this issue, and that the Trump administration is basically throwing away a key tool in their potential toolbox, by trying to work out a deal with Russia here, or include China into this treaty. Maybe that would be huge. They're just throwing it away. Again, that'll be linked to the show notes page. And, John Bolton has recently said that, we listened to, we heard calls from Russia that, not to withdraw from this treaty, but we're ignoring them. look, the Russians say that those missiles aren't in violation of the treaty. We say that they are. And so we're at an impasse and nothing's going to happen. Just a bit of my take on it. It seems ridiculous to me that there's not room for negotiation here, especially since the United States and Russia have so much competition in other places. If you look at Iranian sanctions, the war in Syria, Ukraine, Georgia, NATO expansion, cyber warfare, the general fight against terrorism is something that the United States and Russia actually, I think, generally agree on. And so I think you have potential, to make negotiations happen, to figure out a way to roll China into them. But when John Bolton is the mediator, those seem to not, be options on the table. One thing that I wish would raise huge skepticism of this whole thing is that John Bolton said it was a good idea to withdraw from the anti-ballistic missile treaty back under the Bush administration and was, key in pushing for that. Well, that didn't necessarily turn out very well. The United States has spent a lot of money on these systems and Russia developed a way around them. And so I think strategically it should be seen as a failure. And so now, suggesting we withdraw from another nuclear arms treaty. And, if there's one thing that I think everybody could agree about on nuclear weapons is that we should get rid of them if we can. They're not really offensive weapons that you could use. You can't use a nuclear weapon, then go and take that territory. You destroy it when you use them. The weapons now are so big and so many of them would have to be used in a nuclear war because, you just don't drop one nuke on somebody. You got to take out all their nukes and, prevent their ability to respond. It creates such an environmental hazard that, you're no longer talking about just the deaths of, let's say, 80 million Russians or something like that. You're talking, about the death of hundreds of millions of people. So, this John Bolton guy is obviously pretty sick and awful. John Bolton also said, though, that the United States was going to talk to our allies before we withdraw from this treaty. This seems to me to be maybe the potential bright spot here. From what I've read, France isn't a big fan of withdrawing from this treaty. I believe the Germans have come out and oppose withdrawing from it. I think they see it as advantageous because short-range nuclear missiles from Russia, would, I think, most likely make Europe targets. Hopefully those are the allies that John Bolton is talking about, and he's not talking about Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, who may be the, only people who would cheer Trump on here. I think one of the dangerous things coming up on the horizon with nuclear weapons is nuclear weapons in space. And this is something that the Trump administration hasn't dismissed. Vice President Pence said it's, for the president to decide if we do that, and not outright denouncing it. I think it would be extremely foolish to start to weaponize space. It would be incredibly expensive money that, people starve in the world. Let's do that first. We don't have to build these nuclear weapons in space. Also, I just read that Russia is now working on missiles that could take out satellites. I'm sure the United States is going to complain about this, saying that, this would be a way for the Russians to take out our, communications and important defenses and stuff like that. But would also be a way for Russia to counter potential U.S. nuclear weapons in space. And so, rather than building nuclear weapons in space, it seems to be much smarter to negotiate a treaty where no country develops weapons that could shoot down satellites and no country develops weapons that could be shot from satellites onto Earth and nuke people. The weaponization of space does seem to be something that's been on Vladimir Putin's mind. I've heard him mention it in a few different speeches now. And so, it's just important to remember that, he may push for that. I think him and Trump should be meeting next month in Paris. Of course, Trump has just talked about expanding the size of the nuclear arsenal and saying that, it looks like a new arms race. And so I don't think there's any, but hopefully everybody knows that this would be, I think, bankrupting for the United States. At this point, with our $21 trillion in debt already, it just doesn't seem feasible or manageable. And, hopefully Trump doesn't do that and pursue that option. The next thing he'll be trying to send a man to Mars before the Russians do. And again, it's really worth pointing out here that this seems to be a very interesting shift in Trump's foreign policy. Through the first year and a half, a little bit more maybe, of his administration, he was accused of being too close to Vladimir Putin and too kind to the Russian dictator over, our great democratic, European allies, and now it looks like we're moving back to Cold War. And so it's just a very interesting and very dangerous shift. On the, kind of underground though, a lot of this stuff has been going on the whole time. One important issue is that the push for Ukraine and Georgia to be brought into NATO is still on. This, of course, is, kind of a long-running U.S. policy that's never talked about very much, and the dangers of that. Of course, it looks like that if this name change of Macedonia continues to move forward, that this will be another country joining NATO. But Ukraine and Georgia are, big pushes, for the Trump administration. And, this is dangerous. Russia has drawn a red line here. So hopefully, again, this is something that, can't be negotiated about. And just another marker of kind of the ongoing trend is that the NATO countries are now carrying out their largest military exercise since the Cold War. I guess this is, as far as troop numbers and machinery goes. So not very good signs here moving forward. However, I think the one, possibility and thing that we all could remember is that Donald Trump is president, and he seems, to continue to be the kind of person that if he sits down with Vladimir Putin, and I think Vladimir Putin articulates the Russian position very well on nuclear weapons, that deals can't be reached. And that, of course, you really have to emphasize here that John Bolton cannot be the intermediary. The Korean peace process continues to move forward. Moon Jae-in is ratifying a couple portions of the agreements that he has made and have already been certified by the South Korean legislative branch. So this is great to see. One of these is for a ceremony to happen within the next month or two. That will be the reopening of the rail lines between North and South Korea. It's amazing that, we're not even a year off now from incredible hostilities and threats being exchanged between Trump and North Korea, major U.S. war games going on, North Korea testing nuclear weapons and long-range, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And now we're talking about demining the DMZ, de-arming the truce village. I mean, these are just great steps, and reopening these rail lines and roads, would, make it possible that one day you could see, trains of South Korean tourists going to North Korea, people going to visit relatives they've never seen before. The bad news here is that the Koreans are moving too fast for the Americans, and that the Americans are the world empire. And so if the U.S. starts to threaten to sanction South Korea for being too friendly with North Korea, in the past, the United States has put out that they see that these rail lines as a problem because it violates, the financial sanctions against North Korea. And as I discussed on the last show, they've discussed opening up some branches of South Korean banks in North Korea. And the U.S. says that these would be violations of the sanctions as well. And so here you have what would be like the most backwards and hypocritical situation. The United States is putting pressure on South Korea to slow their re-engagement with North Korea, which the United States says is for the United States to protect our allies in South Korea. I mean, it's completely backwards. The, Koreans want to do things to move closer. The United States should not stand in the way of that. This is all summed up, best, and I think by an article by Tim Shorrock in The Nation, again, linked to on the show notes page. This one's a little bit longer, but again, worth the read. Khashoggi updates. I don't think there's actually many since the last episode. There were reports that the guy was found in the garden, but then I heard those reports weren't true. The release of information here has been pretty slow. And so I think over the next couple of weeks, we'll continue to get information. Again, the problem is that all this information is coming from government sources. And so it'll be interesting to see how much the, Turkish narrative and the Saudi narrative ends up lining up with what independent reporters are able to turn up. And of course, some information is always going to kind of be from the authorities and the official figures of these countries. However, there is independent reporting that could help to back, up those claims or whatever. So hopefully we'll get some of that. Of course, there's still, these stories floating around saying that the CIA now has seen the Turkish footage of the killing and, debates on how involved Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, was in orchestrating this assassination. One thing I can talk about, though, is that there's been a very interesting reaction from, the foreign policy analysis to this killing. Michael Rubin, who writes at AEI, works for AEI, publishes an article discussing how the United States shouldn't let, kind of what went on here, which is horrific, he says. And, I think he explicitly says, if not, he really suggests that Mohammed bin Salman needs to be replaced as crown prince of Saudi Arabia, but that we can't let it taint our other efforts in the region. He specifically mentions, the Iranian problem, and that, we gotta stay close to the UAE for this reason, and then the war in Yemen. His analysis on the war in Yemen is so shallow, pretty much claiming that it's important to defeat the Houthis for the Americans. Really doesn't make, a case as to why, other than the fact that the Houthis do bad things like fire missiles at Riyadh. Now, of course, the problem with this is, and not, necessarily saying that the right thing for the Houthis to do is to fire missiles at civilian targets in Saudi Arabia. But the fact is that Saudi Arabia has been firing missiles and bombs at Yemen on a daily basis for 3.5 years. And those are all at civilian targets. Well, not all, but a good number of them. I think at times estimates report 33% of the targets are civilians. So, to say that the Houthis must unilaterally stop is a ridiculous demand. Adam Johnson, who writes at FAIR, he does really good media analysis, says that one of the things that's going on here is that they're trying to frame this issue now as, kind of look how Saudi Arabia corrupted the U.S. foreign policy. I'm going to link to this article in the show notes page, so if you want to, you could go through and read all the different excerpts that Adam Johnson pulls out here of different people trying to frame it as, like the United States does really good things, and this is just one time where, probably because Donald Trump is stupid, the United States got tricked. And, we supported a bad guy, and all we need to do is replace, Mohammed bin Salman or, whatever other kind of conclusions they have. But it's never the fact that the United States is doing immoral things overseas, that actually leads to us having these allies like Saudi Arabia. And then there's just this interesting story I read in CNN, and that is Twitter is banning accounts that are of people that are trying to smear Khashoggi. Now, again, it's probably not the greatest thing to go around bashing a dead guy, especially this one, since he wasn't like a Saudi official that, Mohammed bin Salman, who helped to orchestrate and, really plan and push the war in Yemen, that are, pretty clearly not those that reflect, great human rights and values for human beings and all that kind of stuff. However, that Twitter is banning these accounts is just another example of how, now Twitter could shift the narrative the other way, right? That they could push to, make this guy seem like he's never done anything wrong and was just some innocent guy trying to expose the terrible things that Saudi Arabia was doing. And, not saying that he deserved to die or anything like that, but, it's important to be able to get an accurate picture, and, Twitter going around suspending these accounts, probably isn't very helpful to that. Glenn Greenwald wrote a pretty good article in The Intercept. I'll link to it in the show notes page. He points out how, this man, David Rothkopf, is an analyst and, gets put on different shows and writes in different outlets for, foreign policy issues. He's wrote a few issues, and commented on a few issues supportive of the United Arab Emirates, and at the same time is a paid consultant to the Emirates. In fact, I think he signed a contract, $50,000 a month for 3 years, roughly a $1.6 million contract. And then, CNN, MSNBC, The Daily Beast have him on, but never disclose this. And so, it's just an example of, why there's, problems with the mainstream media in the United States, and that this is, bought and paid for Emirati propaganda that they're putting on their networks. And then they, don't discuss it, all the while spending a lot of their time on their shows discussing how, Russia bought and changed the U.S. election in 2016. A couple notes on Syria. The first one is Turkey. Erdogan is saying that he's going to deploy more troops to northeast Syria. This may be a threat. He may actually be going about it pretty soon. But I think the United States is, in a bind in Syria, in the fact that, even our NATO allies, Turkey, are putting pressure on us to leave. Of course, that's for a really different reason than Russia and Assad are. But I think it's going to put the U.S. in a harder and harder position to remain in Syria as we move forward. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights released a report, not a perfect organization. I always question their numbers. However, they're one of the few people who do really good work in making any effort to count the deaths in Syria. And so, they say that the United States airstrikes since 2014 have killed 3,222 civilians in Syria. All right, last thing before I wrap up, and that's I read an article on, I believe, Reuters on Libya, and I could link to this one on the show notes page. I think this is something that's worth sharing around just because this is the kind of thing that, 10,000 dead Yemenis will never, get a share or anything like that. But the destruction of like ancient artifacts and monuments will. And this is going on in Libya now. This is, of course, all because of the instability created by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama in 2011 by leading a war to take out the longtime dictator of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, in favor of rebel groups strongly linked with jihadists. The country fractured after that. The United States is still trying to impose a very weak government on the west of the country. The east of the country has been pretty much consolidated by a, thuggish warlord who once worked for the CIA, is accused of war crimes, however, is able to seek medical treatment in Western countries. So, what a mess you have going on there. But, to get people to care about this thing a little bit, try sharing around this article here of the artifacts being, destroyed and vandalized. All right, that's where I wrap up for today. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. I just want to thank everybody so much for tuning in. I'm not somebody who's like got a whole ton of like anything that would, give me credentials as like a foreign policy analyst or anything. I just really like, the subject. Like is always a strange word when you're talking about war. But, I'm interested in, I read, 30 or 40 articles every day of just different things going on in the world. And I have for, the past few years. So I enjoy being able to, to come on the show and talk to you all about the stuff I'm reading and hopefully, share with you some news. Before I was, doing the show, I would always talk to people about foreign policy stuff and they're like, boy, if I just understood it a little bit better, then, I would be waving the anti-war banner all the time. And so I was like, I'll start a show to try to do that. So, I hope you all are enjoying. If you ever have any suggestions for the show, you can always email me. The email address is Kyle's Files, files spelled FYLES, blog@gmail.com. I need to update like the email address and contact pages. You could also always donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I just had a new donor recently. Appreciate everybody who donates. It really does help to like motivate me to keep doing the show. And it's something that, I'm going to use that money to improve the show as we move forward, possibly ads on other shows or whatever else I need, to help to grow a little bit. And then, on Twitter at KYAAALE and, Facebook at Libertarian Union.